Alrighty, can you all see that? Yep, okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, well, as I said, my name is Taylor Rathe, and I'm a graduating senior this year at Miami. I've studied diplomacy and global politics, as well as Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. I'm also a student athlete on the Miami softball team, information which comes handy later when you see my topic. And yes, as I've said, I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Ziolkowski and Dr. Norris throughout my time at Miami. About a year ago during my spring semester, Dr. Ziolkowski approached me about presenting a department honors research thesis about a topic of my choice and doing it throughout the course of my senior year. And I was very excited about the prospect of this, and I'm here today to show you all my research. I'll first talk about the process of writing a thesis like this in Russian, and how my Russian improved, and then I'll explain the content of my research. But first, let me tell you about my topic of choice. While there would be many things I would be interested in studying, I chose to study the Olympics between the US and Soviet Union during the early Cold War years. This topic is personal to me because it combines my 3 experiences at Miami: studying Russian, studying global politics, and being a student athlete. This topic is also significant because although sports and their connection to international politics is being more widely studied, there is a gap in the research of the early Cold War years. One of my favorite movies of all time is A Miracle on Ice, the 1980 US hockey team overcoming all odds to beat the Soviets. Not only is this a true story and a great movie for any aspiring athlete, it also tells the tale of a bunch of ragtag college hockey players beating the greatest hockey athletes of all time. Against all odds, the Americans beat the Soviets at their own craft. It's not hard to see how important this victory was in the political and ideological battles fought in the context of the Cold War. It could be argued that in addition to the space race and nuclear race, there is also an ongoing competition in the Olympics to decide who is a superior superpower in the realm of athleticism, physical fitness, and skill. Unbeknownst to many Americans, Russia has its own story of an underdog defeat. This time, it took place in the American-dominated sport of basketball during the 1972 Olympics in Munich. In a highly controversial victory, the record reflects the Soviets beating the Americans in the final seconds of the game. Similar to the creation of the movie Miracle on Ice, Russian media also released a movie about this called Движение вверх. Both of these episodes during the Cold War were highly political. The record of these victories still stands today in the memories of the victors. For the athletes, the game stays the same, but for everyone else, Olympic competition took on more meaning in the Cold War. These events piqued my curiosity. Prior to my research, I knew little about Soviet sports history. Therefore, the topic of my research surrounded the question of how did these Cold War rivalries transpire? Did they increase gradually over time? And were they connected to the political tension throughout the Cold War? And also, what role did the media and politics play into this relationship? Much of my research focused on the role of media in this superpower sports rivalry and their contribution to it. The majority of my research was focused on primary sources such as the New York Times and Pravda for America and then for the Soviet Union, in addition to a couple other newspaper sources as they contributed to the topic. I read various articles and analyzed their reporting to better understand how journalists framed the idea of Cold War rivalry in the Olympics. As you may surmise, the New York Times and Pravda are not parallel newspaper sources, although they do equate to one another in their relevance to mass media. The comments in the New York Times, especially by editorials, were sensational and outwardly added to the political nature of the Olympic Games. Inversely, Pravda also added to the political effect of the Olympics, but in a much more undercover sort of way, given the fact of state-controlled media. Regarding the construct of my paper, it came out to be about 30 pages in total. Since my research has lasted 2 semesters, I spent the first half of my fall semester and parts of the summer solely conducting research about my topic and discussing it with my professors. I also took that time to research new words and phrases in Russian that I knew would be helpful to studying sports and Olympics. Then between November over winter break and the first months of this semester, I focused on writing. Based on the stories I read from newspaper on the Olympics between 1952 to 1964, I wrote short articles in Russian for the body of my research. I'll share 3 of the many stories later on in my presentation. Then I sent these stories to Dr. Norris and Dr. Ziolkowski for content and grammar review and discussed it with them individually and made subsequent revisions. Most recently, I've put them all together and edited them so it flowed smoothly and created an intro and conclusion and have been reviewing it before finally finishing. As I reflect back on this process, this project has improved my abilities to write in Russian. While I've written Russian papers for class, for homework in the past, I haven't yet had the experience to write such a large amount of content in Russian. So this was a big step for me. Since I wrote so many short articles in Russian, I could review my corrections and see where my tendencies for error were. And I found this to be very helpful. I also became more comfortable thinking in Russian rather than, translating English in my head and using correct grammatical constructions for writing. Throughout this process, I've come to appreciate Russian language even more. I feel much more confident using each case and knowing what its purpose is in each sentence. And I've also found that dates and years in Russian were a little harder than the average Russian learner would like. I mean, it's not very fun saying 1952nd. But after writing this paper, I feel like I can communicate, dates and years much better. So now transitioning to my topic of research, there are several important themes I noted in my paper. The first is that after the Second World War, sport was seen both by the Soviet Union and by the United States as a tool to keep their population physically ready for another conflict. Stalin thought that a strong and healthy population was key to communism. Starting in the 1930s, there was a state committee for physiculture in the Soviet Union. While the Soviets did not begin to compete in the Olympics until 1952, they had developed an advanced infrastructure for sports and athletics in the country. The United States, on the other hand, had participated in the Olympics for many years now and was a dominant player in the games. The US also had the NCAA and Professional Sports League and professional sports development in their private sector. Stalin didn't want the Soviet Union to participate in the Olympics, but rather choose to compete among other communist nations. That changed in 1951, shortly before his death, when he decided to send a Soviet team to the Olympics with the rationale of diplomacy and politics. So by the time Olympic competition between the US and USSR began, the Cold War was already underway. Interestingly enough, the back and forth between American and Soviet journalists had started before the games even began. Richard Daley, a sensational columnist for the New York Times, noted in his editorial in 1952 that, quote, "The United States would like to defeat all countries, but the only country that matters is Soviet Russia. The communist propaganda machine must be silent since there not should be even one sound from it in the Olympics." Pravda would respond to this claim with their own comments by saying, quote, "Every record that our athletes win, every victory in international contests will graphically demonstrate to the world the superiority and strength of the Soviet system." The back and forth between journalists started long before the tensions of the Olympic competition, because the Cold War started before the Olympics. Another journalistic note about the first Olympics was that there were a couple former military veterans on the US Olympic team. Soviet newspaper then declared that all American sporting life was under the Department of Defense and that this was proof of the militarization of Americans. The State Department, as you might guess, was unhappy with this propaganda and tried to negate the narrative. They also had their own propaganda and responded by saying that US athletes must first display American prowess, and secondly, by being an example of American foreign policy goals. The Soviet entrance into the Olympic Games led the US government officials to start having conversations for the first time with sports representatives in the private sector, which showed how much victory in sports really mattered and how it increased in priorities. Something that I found from my research was that journalists played a role in legitimizing the Cold War of the Olympics. As people followed the Olympics through mass media, journalists played a role in continuing to propagate the idea that Olympic competition was more than just sports. In addition to this, the respective governments also had a say in how the Olympics developed, as my previous article highlights. And then to the pictures I have in this slide about the same 1952 Olympics in Helsinki, there's a fascinating episode which shows the atmosphere into which the Olympic competition was set. A Pravda article mentions the reasons that Soviet athletes were sent to the Olympics in Finland. It said that these athletes were taught to demonstrate superiority over bourgeoisie countries and to promote the strengthening of friendship and cultural cooperation between peoples, expressing the will of athletes around the world to fight for peace. Interestingly enough, this was not the sense that many countries received from the Soviet athletes. A New York Times columnist noted that when the first Soviet athletes arrived in Finland, they greeted everyone who was not a communist athlete with cold, unfriendly looks. They seemed to have brought a portable iron curtain with them, since they were forbidden to talk to all outsiders. There was some truth to this, both symbolically and literally. When the Olympic Committee began building the Olympic Village, they didn't know how many countries would be participating. And since the Soviets were last minute in their decision to attend, the committee decided to add on to the Olympic Village to ensure there was enough housing. However, the Soviet delegation told the committee that they wanted all their athletes to live together in the same dormitory and refused any help. So they all ended up in this dormitory that was much, much too small for their needs. And as you can see in this picture outside the building, they put up a large picture of Stalin showing the reasons for being there and sending a message to the delegation of every other country. So much for friendship and fighting for peace. And then another idea I learned from my studies was a research of Petra Godin. She wrote a book called The Politics of Peace, which is about the Cold War. Her main idea comes from the Latin phrase, sivi pacem para bellum, which from high school Latin means, if you want peace, prepare for war. And so her thesis kind of summarizes the idea that much of the Cold War was, in a sense, it was fighting for peace. While she didn't explicitly talk about the Olympics in her studies, I think her ideas apply to the Olympics extremely well. She noted that in this quote unquote fight for peace, the Soviets like to propagandize this in many of their publications, kind of like my last example showed in Finland. And then on the other hand, the United States like to propagandize the battle for freedom in the messages they sent out. The 1960 Olympics in Rome were an example of this, playing out the idea of Americans fighting for freedom. Both the American and Soviet governments realized how important sports were in the battles of the Cold War, and as a result, they increased their propaganda campaigns as time went on. To the Americans and Soviets who watched the Olympic competition played out, this was also a much more tangible way to see and understand the Cold War. The average American didn't understand the technology of the space race or understand details of nuclear weapons. But sports, this was an easy way for people to root for their country amidst great political battle. One of the ways that the Soviets increased their propaganda campaigns was by often reporting in the newspapers that carelessness in contact with Americans was like now extra, extra dangerous. These newspaper articles also included story after story of different types of American spies. One journalist reported that the Soviets were fed a constant diet of spy stories. Of course, athletes were part of this crowd who experienced this campaign, especially in their role as diplomats to the world. On the other hand, the United States had their own program for propaganda program for the Olympics. One of the customs at the Olympic Games is for athletes to trade mementos with other athletes for different countries, like little souvenirs, etc. Well, the US Information Agency made sure that American athletes were equipped with material to project American liberty. The American athletes were given little pamphlets written in Russian that had the text of the Declaration of Independence and other key American documents. And while the Soviet Union continually bombarded the Soviet people with propaganda about American spies, there was some truth in it. The CIA recruited one of the American track athletes to turn one of the Soviet athletes. The CIA believed Igor Terovanesian wanted to defect from the USSR. American athlete David Syme was recruited by the CIA to talk with Igor, and he ended up setting up a meeting with him with an undercover CIA agent. The Soviet ended up backing out last minute due to fears of getting caught by his government. This episode shows again the extent that Americans went to promote their battle for freedom and how deep politics went into the Olympics. These couple examples from the Olympics are just a few of the many political battles that occurred during the Games. While I argue in my paper that there is a general increase in the global politics taking center stage in the Olympics as time goes on, with a little bit of like back and forth, it also follows the political ups and downs as well. While it may be easy to view the Olympics solely in the light of the politics of the Cold War, I want to caution against this overreaching view, because the Olympics weren't as center stage in politics at the beginning during these initial times as they were later on. There's also a period within the Cold War when tensions weren't as high. The beginning of 1960 is one of those times. The Olympics took place after Khrushchev's visit to America and before the U-2 incident with Gary Francis Powers, before the Bay of Pigs incident, and also before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So needless to say, context matters. The Olympics are also many things, but they're first and foremost an athletic competition. And so my last example highlights the true nature of sports and also this time when tensions weren't as high. So now, if I mention American gold medal in men's hockey, the first thing that comes to mind will probably be the American victory in 1980. However, easily forgotten is the story of the American gold medal in the 1960 Olympics. Like in 1980, the Americans beat the Soviets in the semifinal match. However, unlike the latter games, the Soviets supported the Americans in their victory. During halftime, the American team was losing. Some of the American players were friendly with the captain of the Soviet ice hockey team. So during the break, the Soviet captain walked into the Americans' locker room and he ended up giving them a bunch of useful tips. Then after the break, the American team went on to win the game by 5 points. a wide margin in the low-scoring game of hockey. The journalists who wrote about this event noted that the Americans probably would have won anyway. However, the newspaper article I read about the event noted that when nothing else can do it, sport can obviously break the Iron Curtain. Especially in the early years of the Cold War, athletes were diplomats and diplomacy was possible at the Olympic Games. At these same Olympics, Soviet writer Ziolkowski was in California reporting on the games. On the last day, he called to Moscow to talk about the, quote, the flames of Olympic friendship. Pravda published a long article, and so did the New York Times, about Kessil's impressions. He described a scene of very characteristic, a very wonderful, sunny atmosphere of friendship, which seemed even cleaner than the mountain air of that place. As unusual as it sounds from a Soviet in the Cold War, humanity prevailed in some way between the athletes at these games. Kessil also noted the interactions between athletes Bill Disney and Yevgeny Grishin. While Grishin won in speed skating and Disney took second place, afterwards they were laughing cheerfully, childishly playing with a wooden Russian nesting doll, memento that was likely traded at the games. Keep in mind, too, that this was also a time of, better relations, and that this event was not all out of the ordinary in the timeline of political relations. Nevertheless, both of these stories from Squaw Valley sound absurd to fans of the movie Miracle on Ice. But while they may seem to be an exception to the bitter US-Soviet rivalry, I think they highlight one thing. The Olympics were always a platform for Cold War competition, and they started out with less high political stakes at the beginning of the Cold War than at the end. The bitter competition was always there. But there are stories like this one that reveal how diplomacy does work sometimes and the true nature of sports. And to the athlete, at the end of the day, it's all just a game. Of course, the early years of the Cold War led themselves to be an easier platform for diplomacy. So these events from the Olympics that took place were fascinating for me to study, especially the three I shared with you today. As a fan of sports, I learned about some of the great rivalries that took place. I loved reading about them and also reading about the way journalists reported about them, both from the American and the Soviet perspective, and then the impact it had on all the people watching. And of course, a research paper about the Cold War wouldn't be complete if it didn't have a spy story in it. So thank you for listening. I'm also very thankful to Dr. Norris and Dr. Ziolkowski for letting me do this opportunity. And if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them.